All right, everybody, welcome back to section 5 of our criminology course, and today we're going to be talking about learning theory. So, first, we're going to talk a little bit about actual, learning research without regards to criminality just for a minute. And the first big famous scientist to really study how learning happens was this guy named Pavlov, right? He had the famous thing with the dogs where he would ring the bell every time he gave them food, and then he noticed that when he rang a bell later, the dogs would salivate and anticipate food. So, in other words, he used a stimulus, in this case the bell, to create a response in the dogs, the anticipation of food, right? And this form of stimulus response, stimulus response, stimulus response is referred to as classical conditioning. It's a way to teach people, or in this case, dogs or whatever, to do things you want them to do, right? The more complicated version of conditioning and teaching and learning process is called operant conditioning, okay? Now, with operant conditioning, it kind of divides that stimulus and response into 4 categories. There's positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. Now, the positive and negative here do not mean good and bad. Okay, so kind of remove that definition of positive and negative from your head for a moment. In these cases, positive and negative refer only to introduction of something or taking something away, right? The good and bad is reinforcement or punishment. So if you want to modify a person's behavior or a dog's or whatever, you can utilize all 4 of these to modify their behavior. When they do something good, you give them a reinforcement. When they do something bad, you give them a punishment. A positive reinforcement, remember that positive part means giving, and the reinforcement is something good. So a positive reinforcement is the introduction or giving to them of something beneficial or that they like, right? This is like, if your child gets an A on their report card, you give them $20, right? That would be a positive because you're giving them something, reinforcement. A negative reinforcement is the same kind of reward, reinforcing good behavior, but it's about taking something away, right? So if your child does something good, you say, okay, you no longer have to do the chores you were supposed to do tonight. You can go out with your friends. Or that thing you didn't want to do tomorrow, you don't have to do it. You're taking away something they don't like in order to reward them for some behavior. Works the same way with punishment. A positive punishment means giving something or introducing something that is seen as a punishment. So, say corporal punishment would be a positive punishment. You are introducing something, in this case, pain, to punish behavior that you want to discourage, right? A negative punishment is taking something away as a punishment, right? So, if your teenager gets caught smoking marijuana, maybe you take away the keys to their car or something, right? Take away their cell phone. That would be a negative punishment. But remember, positive and negative have nothing to do with good and bad. This is where students mess up most often in this kind of area of my course. Positive and negative do not refer to good and bad. They only refer to introducing or taking away. All right? It's the reinforcement or punishment that refers to the good thing or bad thing. Reinforcing behavior we want to see or punishing behavior we don't want to see, right? Now, there's been lots and lots and lots of research about operant conditioning. And what all of that research shows is that if you want to change the behavior of a person or a dog or anything else that you can kind of teach and train, the reinforcements are much more powerful when it comes to changing behavior than the punishments. It's about a 4-to-1 ratio. It takes about 4 punishments to change behavior as much as 1 reinforcement. Okay? So reinforcement is always a much faster, more effective way of changing behavior. And we'll talk about how this applies to criminology here in a minute, okay? The first major learning theorist in the field of criminal justice was this guy named Sutherland. And he's writing way back in the 1930s, and he comes up with this idea of differential association, right? And differential association is a relatively simple idea that gets more complex and more complex the more you kind of learn about it and talk about it and try to measure it and stuff. But Sutherland's big idea is that everybody starts off as a blank slate, a term he used that's kind of fancy old school Latin term for that is tabula rasa, right? Blank slate. We all start off as nothing. And then we learn from those around us, those we spend time with, those we observe. And that includes criminal behavior, right? So if somebody is going to become a criminal, it's because they learn from watching and experiencing and interacting with and socializing with those around them. Sutherland kind of used this term he called definitions. All right? And the definitions are kind of examples almost, right? So if I'm driving with my father, my father's driving a car, I'm a passenger seat at the young, impressionable age of, 10, 12, something like that. And I see my father, drinking and smoking and doing other kind of negative, deviant things. That definition given to me that I learn from that experience is that those sorts of deviant acts are normal, expected. That is how people are supposed to act, right? So then, I'm 13, 14 years old. I start hanging out with a group of friends. One of my friends decides, oh, we should go shoplift some candy bars and soda from the local corner store. That is also a learning experience where I learn this definition that, oh, these teens that I admire and want to spend time with and thus imitate, they are committing this shoplifting crime. That means it's kind of expected or normal or a good thing. Thus, I will do that kind of thing too, right? So each one of these kind of learning experiences is a definition. And you can have learning experiences or definitions that are pro-law-abiding or pro-deviance. And when you're very young, up until adolescence, the primary group that you're learning these definitions from is your family, especially your parents, but also your siblings. But once you hit about that adolescent age, all of a sudden the primary group that you're learning from, that you're getting these definitions from, isn't your family anymore. It's your peers, the people you're spending time with, your friend group, right? And so if their definitions are different, you are going to learn from them in ways that maybe your parents didn't give you the proper definitions, right? So that peer group might their definitions might override the definitions you've been getting from your parents and siblings and such. These definitions aren't all made at the same level, right? So some definitions can be more or less powerful based on priority, i.e. how recent they were. So the more recent you learn things, the more powerful they're going to be in your mind, right? So a definition you saw or experienced a year ago isn't going to be as powerful as a definition you got, last week or today. They can also be more powerful or less powerful based on duration, right? So spending a lot of time in getting a definition that is pro-crime, that is long-lasting, is going to be more powerful than a shorter experience, shorter definition that is anti-crime. And then, of course, importance, strength. How big is this thing that they're doing that introduced this definition to you? All right. Now, there are both general definitions and specific definitions, all right? General definitions are just kind of values, right? Committing crime is wrong. Religious teachings about following the law and being good and obeying your parents and things like that. Those are all general definitions. Specific definitions are more kind of situation specific, right? So it's okay to download and watch movies for free. Even, stealing is wrong. That's more of a general definition. But, specifically digital piracy, downloading and watching movies that you haven't paid for, that's perfectly acceptable, right? Then there are positive definitions, negative definitions, and neutralizing definitions. Positive definitions are ones that encourage you to do things, whether that's commit crime or skip school or whatever. Then there's negative definitions, which say you shouldn't do things, right? You're learning that something shouldn't be done. And then there's neutralizing definitions, which are kind of lessons about how, normally this would be wrong, but in this case, we can ignore that rule. We can ignore all those things you learned. We can ignore those values in this situation because. All right? All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break, and then we're going to come back, and we're going to talk a lot more about more expansions on Sutherland's learning theory and how these definitions and his concept of definitions hasn't been kind of rejected, but it's been expanded on and modified, and modern learning theories are much more broad than just this relatively simple one from Sutherland, which is just about definitions and peers versus family and so on and so forth. So we'll be right back.